I'm going to show how to create this rectangular grid using Affinity Photo's Procedural Texture Filter. To get started, I'll start with a new document. I've got XGA selected, but I'm going to change it to 1024 by 1024. Make sure the color is set to RGB8. I create that. I'm going to choose black and fill it with black. That gives me a filled pixel layer, which is what I need for my procedural texture filter. I'm going to choose live filter and change it to procedural texture, and this is a blank procedural texture filter dialog box. The top part is for the equations, and then the bottom part will be for custom inputs. I'm going to start with a single equation. I'm going to give that a system variable, which is x. So x is a variable that is assigned to the each pixel across the document. Right now it looks like it colored it all red. It's assigned to the red channel, but if I zoom in on this to the pixel level, I can see that the first row is sort of a dark red. So the first pixel is a dark red. The way the procedural texture filter handles color values is for red, it'll start at black, and then when it's at 1, it'll go fully red. So right now, 1 occurs right after the first pixel. So in order to scale this to a more useful range, I'm going to divide by another system variable, which is h, which stands for the height in pixels of the image. And so that it's divided by that, and you can see that my x-coordinate goes from 0 to 1, and as it does, the red color goes from black to fully red. I'm going to add another equation. In this case, I'll do y divided by h, and that one is assigned to the green channel, and it starts up here at 0 and goes down here to 1 by the time it gets to the bottom. Now I can include both of those variables into a single variable called a vector. So I'm going to do that. I'll make it a 2-element vector, and it'll be x and y, and I'm going to divide by h out here. When you apply an operation to a vector, it applies it to every element of the vector. So since I'm dividing by h, it'll divide by both the x component and the y component. Now I have both the x and the y components as a vector in one equation. I want to be able to move this around and change the origin, and so I'm going to change this to relative x and relative y. Rx and Ry are both system coordinates that are based on the position of the mouse. To use that, I can either double-click the mouse, or I can drag with the mouse to move the origin around to a new position. So if I put it up here, I'm back to approximately what I had to begin with. I'm going to make this into a variable, so I'm going to use the variable operation and call it v0 equals vec2 of that. If I put a semicolon here, it terminates that variable. If I enter, it goes blank, but if I put v0 in again, it'll show the vector v0 as I created it. The next thing I'm going to do is add a custom input so I can change the scale of this. I'm going to call it scale, and I'm going to set it to 1 for now. As I increase scale, the range of the x and y axes will increase. I'm going to multiply by a to apply it to my formula. Now if I increase this, you can see the transition zone gets smaller and the yellow area gets larger. I'm going to add a semicolon to terminate the variable, and I'm going to use the fraction function on v0, and this will eliminate the whole number part of the number. So now you see that it's repeating, going from 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1 for each of these cells. I've got the scale set to 3, and you can see I've got a 3 by 3 grid. I currently only have squares, and I want to make rectangles. So I'm going to add 2 more real number inputs. I'm going to call the first one dx and dy, and I'll label this one distance x and this one distance y. And that'll be the ratio of my rectangular shape. I'll set them both to 1 for now to get started. To use these, I'm going to create another variable. It's going to be a scaling vector. So it's going to be another 2-element vector of dx and dy. I'll terminate that with a semicolon. Here's what it looks like so far. Next, I'll divide my v0 coordinate by my scaling vector. And then, as I change my x and y, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. You can see that this increases. Now, the problem with this is they get quite large. My grid gets quite large and it's no longer contained very well. So I'm going to add another function to this one. I'm going to use the normalize function, and that will create a vector of length 1. So I'll always be using a vector of length 1, and it'll won't be perfect, but it'll help to make this scaling factor a little bit more consistent. I want to be able to shift one of the rows over while leaving the other one behind relative to it. So I want to be able to shift each of these rows over a little bit. In order to do that, I'm going to add a slider, -1 to 1. I'm going to call it OF for offset. And I want to move it, have it change along the y direction. So I'm going to use v0 of y times OF. So let's see what happens with that. As I move this, it is changing with y, but it's making it into these parallel pipe edge shapes, and I don't really want that. What I really want is every time it changes by a whole number, I want it to move over a little bit. In order to do that, I have to round this off. The operation that does that is floor, which will round it down. So I'm going to take the floor of v0.y and multiply that by the offset. Okay, now it's sort of doing it, but it's also shifting. This is being added to both the x component of v0 and the y component of v0, and I really only want it to add to the x component of v0. So I'm going to make this into a vector, 2-element vector, and the second element is just going to be 0. So in that case, I'm going to add this adjustment to the x value and a 0 to the y value. Okay, there I go. So now, as I slide this over, it shifts each consecutive row by a constant amount that's aligned with the whole number value. I'm going to change this into a variable, and I'll call it v. Now that I've got my rectangular coordinate grid set up, I'm going to add a rectangle shape to this. And so I'm going to use the step function, and that takes 2 values, an edge, and I'm going to first apply it to the x component of the v coordinate system. Like that, and I've got to add my edge variable. I'll use a 0 to 1 slider input for that. Call it that, and this I'm going to just call the gap of my object. I'm also going to add the blue channel here so it looks black and white. Now I'm going to multiply this by another step with E, and this will be v.y, like that. Now I've added the 2 step functions. It looks like that. I notice that the thickness of the lines is different in the horizontal and vertical dimensions, and I'd like them both to be the same size. So I'm going to divide my edge by a vector, scaling vector sv.x. I'm going to divide this one by sv.y, like that. And now they're the same thickness. The lines are the same thickness. I can adjust the gap. to make it bigger or smaller, and I can adjust the offset of these. Now really, I'd like it to be able to snap to the 0.5, so I'm going to add one more adjustment to this floor vector where it uses floor. I'm going to divide by 2 there. Now when I bring it all the way over, it'll be right at the halfway point. If I wanted to make these look sort of like boards, I could add another procedural texture, and I'll use one that I've done before, which is wooden. And I'll just change the mix to a multiply, like that. I could also add a gradient map to this. I use the default, change this to a white. I'll turn this one off, and I'll make this one a brick red, and then go back over here. If I make this 2, make this a little bigger, and then set this all the way up. Bring this up a little. Have a nice brick pattern that I can make. There's the whole formula. This is good for a variety of different patterns. So let me know if you have any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.